What would your life be like if you were the smartest person in the room? Would you be looked up to more, trusted more, be considered for more opportunities? Well, in this video, I'm going to give you the 3 simple skills that have helped me consistently be the smartest person in any room after over 11 years as an internationally published academic and entrepreneur. And the first of these skills is making inferences. The results of a 2017 study showed that among the various measures of intelligence, critical thinking ability, which the 3 skills I'm going to train you on here comprise, is the greatest predictor of real-world success. That means money, career growth, and even your personal relationships. And one of the most reputable tests out there that measures critical thinking ability is the Watson-Glasser test, and the average person gets only a little more than half of the questions on this test correct. A score of even 70% on this test means you're in about the top 10% of critical thinking ability. But for each of these skills, I'm going to train you how to do even better than that. And learning how to make inferences is especially important to achieve this. But it's also an especially tricky area of reasoning because making inferences is all about taking some statement and determining how much evidence exists for or against it. But how do we exactly determine what is evidence for something versus what is not evidence for something? Can't evidence be biased or even totally subjective? Well, it can definitely seem that way. And so we have to have an objective method of collecting evidence that is totally immune to all of our biases and subjective judgments. But how do we do that? Well, we can start by considering what are called all plausible options until we systematically eliminate all plausible options except one. For instance, let's imagine you go outside and there's water all over the ground. Well, what exactly are all the plausible options here? Well, all plausible options means literally any option we can think of that's actually possible. For instance, could sprinklers have been running before you came outside and that's why the ground is wet? Could kids have been playing with water balloons outside? Hell, could someone have deliberately come outside with buckets of water and dumped them on the ground? And of course, could it have simply rained? Yeah, we have to admit, this is all plausible. But what's really the most likely? Well, you might automatically think, well, duh, it rained. But we can't assume this, especially because many times there are claims that sound really reasonable that there actually isn't any evidence for. After all, innocent people do end up in jail. Products we thought were safe have ended up harming millions. So how do we determine evidence in a rigorous way? Well, with our example of water on the ground, we would form what's called a hypothesis. That is, we would pick one of the options we think is most likely true, in this case the idea that the rain caused the ground to be wet. But here's where most people make the biggest mistake. They then go on to try to confirm their hypothesis, or in other words, they try to prove their hypothesis is correct. This might sound like a reasonable thing to do, but this isn't how a true critical thinker thinks, because this approach leads to something called confirmation bias. In other words, it leads us to cherry pick data, seeing what we want to see, and leaving out details we don't want to see. In short, it leads us to the dangerous place of creating our own reality. And how many people do you know who do this? Instead, we need to do exactly what is done in science and statistics. We need to actively try to prove our hypothesis false. But how do we do this? Well, let's consider our hypothesis that it rained. How would we try to disprove it? Well, the first thing I would do is check my weather app. Does it say it's gonna rain today? When I look at it, it actually says it's not gonna rain. So it's strike 1 against my hypothesis. But one piece of evidence against it, even if strong, might not be enough. So the next thing I'm gonna do is knock on my neighbor's door and ask them, did you see whether it was raining earlier? And they respond to me, well, I've been outside most of the day and it didn't rain at all. That seems like it's strike 2 against my hypothesis. But I want to be extra sure. Now, I know that if it were raining earlier, the humidity would be higher than usual, so I find a device to measure the humidity in the air, and I now see that the humidity is lower than usual. It seems that there's quite a lot of evidence against my hypothesis, even though it's perfectly reasonable. Do you see now why we have to actually check, and why we have to actively try to prove ourselves wrong? This is the sign of a true critical thinker, and it takes practice because we are often tempted to simply believe what we want to believe. If you want to practice this skill further, feel free to check out my free critical thinking masterclass in the pinned comment below. But what do we do next? Well, we simply try another hypothesis and go through the same process until we've eliminated all hypotheses except one. This process is called inductive reasoning. And do you see how using this can help you achieve true self-mastery? Well, it can, but it's not enough. We still need the second of the three skills to help us, and that second skill is analyzing relevance. Imagine you're currently evaluating a new opportunity, and your main priority is to find an opportunity where you can work with positive and friendly people. Income is important to you, but you list it as second to your desire for a good work environment. As you evaluate the opportunity, however, the employer really tries to sell you on the perks of the job and also the income potential. The starting salary is not only above your expectations, but the employer also points out several opportunities for promotion that come with even larger salary increases. During your interviews, while you walk the halls of the office, you notice some coworkers fighting, and then you also see nothing but bored and tired faces of the coworkers surrounding them. But by this point, you've been sold so much on the perks and income potential that you overlook and dismiss these obvious red flags. This is a great opportunity, you tell yourself. When the job offer comes, you end up accepting, but a few months down the road, you realize you're miserable. And why? Because you started with the original premise, I'm looking for a job and my priority is a great work environment, yet you ultimately paid more attention to aspects that were irrelevant to this goal. And this is a very tangible way failing to spot irrelevance can completely ruin your life. But how many times have we heard statements of irrelevance such as, that person is disorganized, so they must not be very focused or hardworking, or my friend likes it, so it must be good. These are all examples of logical irrelevance, and the more you can spot them, the more successful you'll actually be in life. But still, this skill isn't enough to help us master critical thinking. For that, let's turn our attention now to the third and final skill, forming deductions. Let's examine the following statement. To cut expenses, a company got rid of its IT department and outsourced its IT needs to an outside company. By doing so, the company has saved 20% of its revenue. Now let's take the following statement. Outsourcing IT needs to outside agencies will save companies 20% of their revenue. Is this a good argument or a bad one? If you said it's a bad one, you're right. And the reason is simple. We can't make generalizations based on specific cases. However, this is one huge mistake in reasoning people make all the time. For instance, have you ever heard of a great success story of someone who made it, and they start telling everyone they achieved their success after reading some specific book or after investing in some specific asset? Have you ever noticed how many people start following that person, trying what they tried, and falling flat on their faces because of it? Well, it's all because they made an invalid deduction. They took a specific case and made a general conclusion about it. That isn't to say we shouldn't consider that success story. After all, the person became successful for some reason. Instead, we need another line of reasoning to get to the root cause of why something happened or why something is the case. And that involves looking at all the people who succeeded at that activity and all the people who failed and trying to determine what factors played the biggest role in those outcomes. But how do we get better at stopping ourselves from making invalid conclusions from specific cases like this? Well, it all comes down to asking ourselves a simple question when faced with a statement like this. Namely, could it be otherwise? For instance, if we again take the statement, to cut expenses, a company got rid of its IT department and outsourced its IT needs to an outside company. By doing so, the company has saved 20% of its revenue. And then analyze the conclusion, outsourcing IT needs to outside agencies will save companies 20% of their revenue. We should simply ask ourselves, could it be otherwise? In other words, could it be true that outsourcing IT needs won't save companies 20%? Well, duh, obviously. But whereas this example is obvious, we need to actively practice asking ourselves this question because there are plenty of situations in our lives in which these are trickier to spot. For instance, in the case of these common startup success stories we discussed, ask yourself, could it be otherwise? In other words, is it possible, even likely, for someone to drop out of college to launch a startup and not end up becoming a billionaire like Mark Zuckerberg? Well, duh, yes. And that's why in order to truly become successful, whether that's in terms of wealth, happiness, relationships, or anything else, we have to understand when and how to use each of the three skills we've discussed in the appropriate ways. I even encourage you to go back to each example we've discussed in this video to practice imagining different scenarios each of these skills applies to. Remember, critical thinking is a strong predictor of life success. So if you're able to master it, you'll master yourself. If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact not only on your own life, but on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.